Good morning, everybody. Well, not terrible Saturday morning. It's my privilege this morning to introduce to you Dr. Douglas Forsyth, who is an associate in the history department at Bowling Green State University. Dr. Forsyth is author of the Crisis of Liberal Italy, Monetary and Financial Policy. He is co-editor of The Origins of National Financial Systems, Alexander Gerschenkron, Reconsidered, and of Regime Changes, Macroeconomic Policy and Financial Regulation in Europe from the 1930s to the 1970s. And we'll let him talk with us today about NATO's future.
Thank you. So I'm supposed to talk to you today about the future of NATO. Well, good luck with that. Historians are supposed to know that they can't predict the future. Unlike political scientists and economists, who are supposed to engage in forecasting and of course do it badly. I know I can't predict the future in general, and predicting the future of NATO in the present context is particularly fraught. We've been on a wild roller coaster in security politics over the last 10 years, and there's every indication the ride isn't over yet. In fact, I think the really wild parts are just about to come. Let's just review how tumultuous the past 10 years have been in security politics. In late 2013, a popular movement coalesced on Maidan Square in Kyiv, protesting against Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych's decision not to sign an EU-Ukraine Association Agreement at the prompting of Vladimir Putin, the Russian president. In February 2014, Yanukovych fled the country and a pro-Western government came into power in Ukraine. By late February 2014, little green men were securing the Crimean Peninsula on Russia's behalf, and in March, Putin annexed Crimea. By annexing Ukrainian territory, Putin tore up the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, an international treaty signed by Belarus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and Britain, and France and China. Two other nuclear powers signed associated documents. The Budapest Memorandum essentially guaranteed the international borders of the three ex-Soviet republics, which renounced nuclear weapons. And all nuclear weapons deployed on their territories were removed by the Russians. In other words, in 2014, Putin reneged on an international treaty signed by Russia in 1994, promising to respect existing international boundaries, reminding observers of another European leader who tore up international agreements his country had signed during the 1930s.
Yeah.
War broke out in the Donbass region of Ukraine bordering Russia, pitting the Ukrainian army against self-styled pro-Russian separatists, who often turned out to be Russian and not Ukrainian citizens, and were in any case supplied by the Russians. In November 2016, Donald J. Trump was elected president, despite losing the popular vote in US presidential elections, and he took office in January 2017, promising sweeping changes in American foreign policy. Trump's long-held critical views of NATO were widely known. The Russian intelligence services launched a sweeping propaganda campaign in favor of Trump's candidacy, especially on social media. The Russians leaked secret US documents to the press that portrayed Hillary Clinton, Trump's opponent in the 2016 presidential campaign, in an unfavorable light. Representatives of the Russian security services actually met with representatives of the Trump campaign on the 9th of June 2016. And Trump swept into office with an unusually large number of advisors who had close connections with Russia, including Paul Manafort, who had been the campaign manager of that Yanukovych, right? That Ukrainian president who fled after the Maidan protests, Michael Flynn and Carter Page. Then there was the summer of 2018, perhaps the low point up to now of the Atlantic Alliance. On the 9th of June, Trump got into a confrontation with Angela Merkel at the G7 meeting in Lamal Bay in the Charlevoix region of Quebec, Canada. He also managed to insult Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and the Canadian host of the meeting, Justin Trudeau, at the meeting. And this is the picture, the famous picture, right, that you know, from that meeting. One of the principal bones of contention at the meeting was Trump's insistence that Russia be asked to rejoin the G7, from which it had been expelled because of the annexation of Crimea. He was alone among the heads of state represented to hold that opinion. Trump refused to sign the joint communique drawn up by the Canadian hosts for the first time in the history of the G7. First time that they always had a communique at the end of the meeting, fairly anodyne documents for the most part. And it's the first time that one of the G7 member heads of state or heads of government refused to sign a communique. After quarreling with the United States' closest allies, Trump traveled to Singapore on the 12th of June for his first love-in with Kim Jong-un of North Korea. A month later, at the NATO summit in Brussels, we now know Trump came close to withdrawing the United States from NATO. In fact, John Bolton, who was the national security advisor at the time, has since told us that when Trump rose to speak at the conference on the 12th of July, Bolton didn't know whether he would announce the US's withdrawal from the organization or not. Bolton had counseled Trump against it, needless to add, as had Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, and James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense. And didn't do it. The week after the NATO conference ended, Trump had his love fest with Vladimir Putin at the US-Russian summit in Helsinki, Finland. This is where Trump conspicuously deferred to the Russian leader and appeared to accept his denial of Russian involvement in the US presidential election in 2016 at face value and against the determination of US intelligence services, not to say overwhelming public evidence. After this nadir in the US's relations with its allies and with NATO, there was a period of a certain calm. Trump started taking credit for the decisions on the part of other NATO members to honor their defense, to boost their defense expenditures, and he thereby embraced the alliance. He dialed back the confrontation with allied heads of state. The reasons for this change, of course, are not fully clear. One analyst, Leonard August Schulte, has argued that Jens Stoltenberg, NATO's Secretary General since 2014, almost single-handedly convinced Trump to make his peace with the alliance by proclaiming that he had achieved a major policy victory by forcing the United States as NATO allies to increase substantially their defense budgets. Stoltenberg allegedly drew Trump's attention repeatedly and skillfully to his alleged successes on this front and away from his demands that Russia be treated as a friend. Trump had other issues to deal with, of course, in the second half of his presidency. The news about his phone conversation with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on the 25th of July, 2019, demanding that Ukraine investigate Hunter Biden, leaked in September, leading to his first impeachment in the House of Representatives in December 2019, and his trial in the Senate in January and February 2020. Then came the COVID pandemic. Once Joe Biden became president in January 2021, he went out of his way to mend relations with US allies and shore up the NATO alliance. Then came the Russian attack on the Ukraine in February 2022. At first, it looked as if the Russians would overrun Kyiv about as quickly as they'd overrun Crimea 6 years earlier. US officials, you will recall, were initially preoccupied with spiriting Zelensky out of his capital before it fell. But Ukrainians rallied to the defense of their country and the offensive stalled. Once it became clear that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was not going to be a cakewalk, the United States and its NATO allies rushed military aid to Ukrainians. In late 2022, the Ukrainians, armed with NATO weaponry, launched offensives in the east in the area around Kharkiv, and in the south in Kherson province, pushing the Russians back. The Russians cut off natural gas deliveries to Europe at the beginning of the war. So the pipelines were also sabotaged apparently by the Ukrainians, right? But the Russians also unilaterally cut off gas supplies. During the summer of 2022, the experts debated whether this would lead to the collapse of the European economy in the winter of 2022 to 23, and to Europeans freezing in their homes. But the winter was exceptionally mild, and deliveries of American liquid natural gas made up for much of the energy imports lost from Russia. Ukraine's foreign supporters began arguing that Ukraine could actually win the war, driving the Russian army from its soil and forcing political change in Russia. The Russian effort to drive a wedge between the United States and Europe failed. In May 2022, Finland and Sweden applied to join NATO. Finland had been neutral since the end of World War II. Sweden had been neutral since the early 19th century. In the meantime, Finland actually has joined NATO, and Sweden's entry into the defensive alliance seems likely in the course of 2024. By the late spring of 2023, a Russian collapse in the Ukraine war seemed to be in the cards. The Ukrainians were meticulously preparing a summer offensive with ample supplies of new NATO equipment. On the 23rd of June 2023, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner mercenary group, launched a rebellion against Russian armed forces. He captured Rostov-on-Don, the headquarters of Russia's Southern Military District, a key staging center for the war against Ukraine, and sent an armored column on the road to Moscow, which got within 400 kilometers of the Kremlin. Was the Putin regime ever in serious danger? It's hard to determine, but its stability looked shaky, even after Prigozhin called off his march on the capital. But we haven't reached the end of the roller coaster ride. In summer 2023, Ukraine's much anticipated summer offensive stalled out after achieving very modest gains. Putin reconsolidated his control over the Russian state. He launched a mobilization drive that netted him hundreds of thousands of new soldiers. The Russian economy has been mobilized, and its output of war materiel has increased substantially. By early 2024, it's the Ukrainians that appear to be running out of artillery shells and anti-aircraft rockets. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is rising in the polls again, and he's turning the Republican Party against the Ukraine. A supplementary funding bill for Ukraine is stuck in the US Congress as I speak, and I think all but dead, right?
Yeah.
Trump appears to be determined to allow Putin to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. I can envisage so this is where we are, right? And I'm supposed to predict the future. I can envisage two very different scenarios for the future of NATO at this strange moment in history. First, let's assume that Biden manages to get himself elected to a second term and manages to route enough war material to Ukraine to stabilize the fronts over the course of the winter and spring. He could use Russian assets frozen in Western banks, right? If Congress won't vote any more money, for example, right? And a lot of us have been urging him to do precisely that. Let's assume that the Europeans either manage to overcome Hungary's veto of more aid to Ukraine. Actually, they have now. The Hungarians have relinquished their veto, right? And the Europeans have just approved a 50 billion euro package to aid Ukraine.
Yeah.
Let's assume that the Hungarians acquiesce in Sweden's entry into NATO. This is the last shoe to drop. Since the Hungarians have withdrawn their objections to the EU aid to Ukraine, I'm guessing they're gonna to do that too. The alliance's future could be bright. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, NATO has a coherent defensive battle plan. You know, for a long time after the Baltic states joined NATO, there was basically no way that NATO could defend the territory of the Baltic states against a Russian offensive through Belarus and through Russia. We hoped, we were in the same situation we were in defending West Berlin during the Cold War, right? West Berlin was indefensible by any conventional means. And there was a fig leaf of an allied force, like a British, American, and French force in West Berlin. And everybody understood that the only way that West Berlin could be defended was by very early use of nuclear weapons, right? Which would lead to World War III. And so there wasn't a realistic battle plan, right? There was a strategy of deterrence, essentially. And that's kind of where we were for the first 10 years, after the Baltic countries joined the NATO alliance too. But now we actually have a battle plan. The Supreme Allied Commander of Europe is an American general named Christopher G. Cavoli, and he's considered to be one of the most capable military officers of his generation. And we have Finland and Sweden as alliance members, right, which makes the whole Baltic theater look more defensible. Russia, meanwhile, has taken as many as 300,000 casualties in the Ukrainian war, maybe more by now, because they've been taking incredible casualties in the month of January too. And is now taking tanks manufactured in 1960 out of mothballs and deploying them on the front lines. A few years ago, the Baltic states looked about as defensible as West Berlin during the Cold War, but the accession of Finland and Sweden to the alliance improves the strategic situation on the Baltic front considerably for NATO. It should be years before the Russians can seriously challenge NATO's defensive perimeter again. One has to imagine they're going to have to rebuild their military a bit after this war in Ukraine, right? The question is how many years? And just the other day I saw a piece suggesting it might be as little as 5. That's the worrisome thing. And let's look at also at the larger geopolitical situation. For most of its existence, national security experts have believed that the Atlantic Alliance was and is fragile. If somebody had told me, I've been teaching about NATO for most of my career, and if somebody had told me 20 or 30 years ago that in early 2024, as a 68-year-old, I'd be preparing a paper for the Foreign Policy Association about the crisis facing NATO, I would have burst out laughing. The news would have confirmed that in 2024, NATO still existed and that it was still in crisis, just like in 2004 or in 1994 or in 1984, 1964, 1954, whatever, right? Already in the 1950s, analysts detected a fundamental flaw at the center of NATO's strategy. Deterring the Soviet Union required convincing both the Soviets and American allies that the United States would not hesitate to use nuclear weapons to defend Western Europe, even as the Soviet Union developed the ability to strike targets in the continental United States with nuclear weapons. Would the United States put Washington and Chicago in danger to defend Hamburg? I teach my students about this, of course. It's called NATO's strategic dilemma in the literature. I also teach my students, relying on Mark Trachtenberg's foundational study, A Constructed Peace, that the Soviets and the Americans reached a sort of bargain in the early 1960s after the Cuban Missile Crisis that made it far less likely that the Cold War would become a hot war. Germany would not become a nuclear power. This would reassure not only the Soviets, but also the French and the British. Precisely because Germany would not become a nuclear power, the United States would continue to station its military forces in forward positions on the European continent, most notably in Germany itself. Mark Trachtenberg has pointed out to us that this bargain, which was never fully expressed in diplomatic documents, created a highly unusual security architecture in Europe. The largest state in Western Europe and the one with the largest economy remain non-nuclear, as did Japan in East Asia. US forces remain garrisoned abroad, including on the soil of former great powers, notably Japan, Germany, and Britain. NATO cemented this bargain. The bargain was reformulated after the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union between 1989 and 1994. The reunited Germany became a member of NATO, Germany remained a non-nuclear state, and US troops remained stationed on German soil. This is a historically unprecedented arrangement, and it had its origins in the very specific circumstances at the end of World War II. It has lasted much longer than anyone could have imagined when the North Atlantic Treaty was signed back in 1949. Even the architects of the post-war settlement doubted its staying power. Dwight Eisenhower, who was NATO's first Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, he had the same job that General Cavoli has now, right? Thought that the Europeans would tire of the presence of American troops on their soil and of America's preeminent role in their security over time. He wanted to make sure that Americans marched out of Europe before Europeans threw them out. Charles de Gaulle expected American isolationism to reassert itself and thought that Europe needed to prepare for a future in which it would have to deter the Soviets on its own. And French presidents have continued to say things like that right up to and through Emmanuel Macron, right, the current French president. The famous dictum of Hastings Lionel Aimé, or Lord Aimé, who was NATO's first Secretary General in 1952, stipulated that the alliance's purpose was to keep the Russians out of Europe, that is, the Americans in and the Germans down. As noted, when he allegedly made this remark, there was considerable worry in Europe that the United States might retreat into isolationism, again, as it had after World War I. America still has troops garrisoned in Europe 72 years later. Americans certainly have the strong sense that they will need to focus their security policy on China in the future, and they would very much like to leave more of European security to Europeans. For the optimistic scenario to play out, we need to hope that the transition can be gradual. Now, keeping Germany down has an excessively crude ring to it in 2024, but it is a matter of significance that Germany and Japan, the world's third and fourth largest economies respectively, are still non-nuclear powers in 2024. This is because of the nuclear umbrella that the United States has extended over Europe and East Asia since 1945. Germany and Japan will have to become nuclear powers if the security architecture of the post-World War II era disintegrates. And this will give a powerful impetus to nuclear proliferation worldwide. The implications of this are being debated, but I, for one, feel that the United States' long-standing effort to restrain nuclear proliferation has had positive effects. Finally, NATO is still needed because it is still imperative to contain Russia. It's clear that Russia under Putin will seek to expand its sphere of influence by force. If Ukraine had folded quickly in 2022, Putin's next objectives would have been Moldova, the Baltic republics, the other states in the Russian near abroad, and so on, maybe all the way back to Berlin and beyond. One reason that Sweden has applied to join NATO is because it was more or less clear that Russian battle plans to reoccupy the three Baltic republics entailed occupation of the Swedish island of Gotland. I could have spent the entire talk today parsing NATO's eastward expansion, beginning with Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary in 1999, and continuing with Bulgaria and Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia in 2004, Albania and Croatia 2009, Montenegro in 2017, and North Macedonia in 2020. A serious critique of NATO's eastward expansion can be developed. George W. Bush clearly went too far when he welcomed an application to NATO by the Republic of Georgia. The Russians responded by sending troops into South Ossetia, a province of Georgia, in August 2008, instituting a frozen civil war and putting Georgia's NATO application on ice. But the basic reality in Eastern Europe is that the states in the former Soviet bloc feel insecure vis-a-vis Russia. Imagine that. And they have sought the strongest security guarantee on offer, which is membership in NATO. NATO's expansion eastward has fueled Russian insecurity, but if NATO had limited its expansion eastward, it would have left the states in the region dangling between East and West and subject to subversion by the Russians. We can see the results of this dangling today in Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, and Belarus. It's hard for me to see how ceding an extensive security glossise to Russia would have stabilized Europe. The countries left dangling in the middle have tended to destabilize the region, harboring more or less frozen civil wars and sending waves of immigrants as local economies have faltered. Now, let's take a look at the pessimistic scenario. Donald Trump is reelected president in November 2024. Don't kid yourselves. He's going to withdraw the United States from NATO,
Yeah.
handing East Central Europe to Vladimir Putin on a silver platter.
Yep.
Why? I have no idea. This guy's philo-Russianism defies rational explanation. The only thing that's clear about it by now is it runs very deep. Trump's primary objective on reassuming the presidency will be to conduct a kind of civil war here in America, which by his own account and that of his future aides will involve mass incarceration, beginning with immigrants, right? and ending with who knows who. The end of the rule of law and the consolidation of an authoritarian regime. How exactly his domestic project will unfold defies the imagination, certainly my imagination. But it's safe to assume that it will prevent the United States from projecting power abroad for some time. The Europeans will be left to their own devices. Germany will almost certainly acquire nuclear weapons. Don't think they're not already planning it.
Oh, yeah.
Indeed, reputable security analysts posit that Poland will acquire nuclear weapons. And I think we can all agree that a nuclear Poland is just what we need, right? Will Europe successfully transition to become a superpower? Will elites in Germany and other European states negotiate an accommodation with Russia? It seems to me that the withdrawal of the United States into isolationism will set off a series of adjustments of such far-reaching dimensions that speculating about them quickly becomes idle. One near certainty is that China will invade Taiwan.
Yep.
Some Republicans proclaim that the strategy of withdrawing from an active American role in European security politics is meant to strengthen the United States' profile in East Asia, but it's hard to imagine that playing out in the real world. If the United States abandons Europe and Russia seizes Ukraine, it's not going to impose restraint on the Chinese. A Chinese invasion of Taiwan will trigger South Korea and Japan to become nuclear powers immediately, and don't think they're not already planning that too. Trump has already anticipated this in public. You can check the footnotes, right, in the version of this paper that we're passing out. They will be followed by Vietnam and Indonesia in very short order. What lies farther over the horizon defies my imagination. I just doubt it's anything very good. The historian Francis J. Gavin has argued in two fairly recent books that constitute essential reading if you're interested in reading up on nuclear issues and US nuclear strategy. I would recommend them, right? They're kind of the places to start. He has argued that while the United States' formal security policy has never put nuclear non-proliferation at its center, in actual fact, American governments have always accorded a high priority to slowing proliferation. A second Donald Trump presidency would accelerate proliferation massively. A lot is riding on the US presidential elections of 2024. Journalists have been telling us quite accurately for several election cycles now that we can face exponentially higher consequences for the choices we make in our elections than we have in the recent past. And that should be crystal clear to voters now. And that's, I'm afraid, as far as my ability to peer into the future goes.
If Donald Trump does remove the United States from NATO and China becomes emboldened enough to attack Taiwan, what would be the consequences of Chinese involvement in Africa?
Oh.
I don't know. I mean, the China is already the largest trading partner of Africa, right? Certainly Black Africa, I think all of Africa, right? And so China's a major player in Africa right now. I have nothing to add. If they successfully invade Taiwan, I have no idea what that world looks like.
I'll bring you my microphone just so our people on the computer.
Right now, our military can't fight a war in Taiwan and in Europe. So just opinion, which one, if we had to make a choice, we may have to in very near future, which one do we go to? Which one do you think we should go to? Which one do you think we'll decide to go to?
I think we shouldn't let the Ukraine go down the drain.
I don't know either.
You're asking about, about World War III. I don't have anything intelligent to say about, the first and second stages of World War III. I hope somebody else is thinking about this.
I think that, is it off? I think that, Xi Jinping is waiting to see what happens in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And then, like you said, he would be emboldened. Well, one thing you said that I wondered about, you said that you did not know why Trump would, forge a sort of alliance with Putin. Well, all the dictators of the world are banded together. Oh, I'm not on. Okay.
Yeah, just.
Lukashenko, Putin, Kim Jong-un,
I can understand.
all of them, Kim Jong-un, Putin, Lukashenko, I mean, the list is long of dictators and people who have not been fairly elected, and they all band together, and Putin, Trump, as you mentioned, really wants to be a dictator. And so he's palling around with those same guys.
Trump has nice things to say about strongmen. We've seen it again
Oh, yeah.
and again. Beyond that, I don't know what to say.
I saw nothing wrong with Trump asking NATO to give 2%, by the way.
Yeah.
And they are all doing that out of fear now. They are trying to get. So, my question is, because I don't understand this, why did the Russians under Obama decide it was okay to go into Crimea and support the separatist regions? And then they didn't do anything, and then Biden got in and they decided it was okay to invade Ukraine. And I never understand why that didn't happen to Trump, because he's so evil with most people, I imagine. But why that didn't happen to Trump, but that happened under Obama, who I voted for, by the way, and Biden. I just don't understand how that could happen.
I don't know either. One thing I could say is the Russians must have had privy to the information that Trump was contemplating withdrawing from NATO. And they may have wanted to give him as much room as possible to do the deed.
But that didn't explain what happened under Obama. The Crimea fell under Obama because Trump wasn't in office under Obama.
Well, I think that the reason the Russians annexed Crimea in 2014 is, first of all, they had a president on whom they exerted considerable influence, and this guy abandoned his capital, right? And I think they saw an emergency there. But certainly Obama was president and Putin felt emboldened to annex Crimea, if that's your point.
And nothing happened.
Well, I mean, there were sanctions were imposed on the Russians. I wouldn't say nothing happened. Obama didn't think that was the right time and place to start World War III. The Russians violated a treaty, right? An important treaty, right?
Good morning. Good morning. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Forsyth. My question is actually kind of a twofold question. There's this idea or this notion of fear instilled in like people here in America, if we think about their relationship to politics outside of America. Now, my first question is, given the history often repeats itself, what do you think that we can do to alleviate, some of the anxiety that like our family holds about certain things? Like, for example, I'm from rural Mississippi, and so there, this is something like there is this like fear that the world is going to end. So I would like to know, would you have any type of suggestions that we can share with our people to kind of help them do that? And then the second part, I guess it's kind of the same way. Could you, I guess they just do not want me to ask questions. Okay.
Those microphones are
But,
really
the final
simple.
part is, I guess it kind of goes with it, again, can you give a way to explain to a layperson what's going on with this situation? Like, I'm in academia, so I understand what you're saying. But if I want to make my people feel more comfortable about what's going on, can you share some tips to do that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to say to reassure you. I don't feel very comfortable about what's going on so many different fronts, no? We could have talked about a lot of other issues that are rather worrisome too, no? This is just one. I really can't say. I take your point that, that it's kind of complicated and it's hard to explain. And it could be, you're suggesting that probably I'm assuming some background knowledge in the talk I gave today that not everybody has too. I think you're right about that. If you ask me to give a talk, right, to a different audience, I might try to redraft it to make it to make it a little bit more accessible. I wish I could give you assurances about anything, no. But I don't think I can, at least not honestly. If I try to do it dishonestly, it's not going to be very convincing.
Well, that's fine, Dr. Forsyth. Thank you again for your insight.
Yes.
This is a little bit less theoretical, okay? I was interested in hearing you say, as a given, that there was Russian interference in the Trump election. I have always assumed that was true, but
That's what the US government says.
I mean, first time I've heard academic, some person say it.
No, this is, the US government has said this. I'm not saying anything unusual here. I mean, I'm not saying that the Russians ran the Trump campaign. I don't know that. I know they had that one meeting that we've all seen reported over and over again, right? But what we know is that the Russians, extensively, projected material on social media in favor, against Hillary Clinton and in favor of Trump, right? We all know that. The US government has determined that.
I have believed it, but I appreciate your affirmation. With so much going on out there that's.
Yeah, this is not some unique position that I hold alone.
But that's my point.
This is an easy one. Just on our artillery, we're speaking, okay?
Yeah.
Biden said that we're running out of ammunition, but that's not really true. And we have to get rid of our artillery stockpiles because they are getting very old. And North Korea is giving their artillery shells to the Russians. And what's happening with their stuff is it's exploding in the Russians' faces. It's not very well done, and it's very old. It's from the 1950 Korean War, that they're giving them a lot of that stuff. So I just wanted to clarify that we have plenty of artillery to give to the Ukrainians because we have to remove it anyway. We have to keep upgrading it. We can't just let it stockpile for 50 years or 40 years. So.
I'm not an expert on this. One has to be aware of my of technical limitations of my knowledge. I think that we're kind of facing a situation now in the Ukraine-Russian war a little bit like the belligerents in World War I in the shells crisis, right? Very quickly they realized that all of the war material which they had husbanded on the eve of the war vanished in battle, right? And the Russians have run their stocks down really low. And I think that frankly, the United States and its NATO allies have run our stocks down very low too. Everyone is alarmed. And we're ramping up production, right, of artillery shells again, but not as quickly as the Russians are at the moment. And everybody's low, right? It's worrisome. You're right, I mean, those, some of those old shells weren't gonna last forever, right? But we got a problem on our hands here, no? The West has a problem on its, assuming that we have some commitment, right, to seeing the Ukrainians through this war, which obviously some people don't have.
You're a finance guy.
Yeah.
How on earth has the Ukrainian, economy survived with people apparently having everyday lives and jobs? Any comments?
Yeah, with massive foreign aid, you know, I mean, this war has made a huge hole in the Ukrainian economy. It's not just that they've lost 20% of their territory, right, that was occupied by the Russians, but supply lines have been disrupted. Shipping on the Black Sea is at a fraction, right, of pre-war levels. The Ukrainian economy is, you know, a shadow of its former self, right? And it's been surviving on aid from the US and its European allies. I mean, they've done a fairly remarkable job, right, with the challenges they've been facing, but.
What role will the economy and the economic pressures, the boycotts, et cetera, because the times we didn't have this pressure is when countries like China and Russia didn't have the greatest of economies. So why don't we, or how can we use this as a weapon rather than shells use the economy?
Yeah. So, you know, one of the things that the Biden administration did right away when the Russians invaded Ukraine in February 2022, 2 years ago, was impose sanctions on the Russians, right? Far-reaching sanctions. And they've certainly had an effect, right? They've hurt the Russians. And we've managed, one thing that's kind of remarkable is the Russians in turn, you know, that they thought that they could bring Europe to its knees by cutting off energy supplies, right? And that didn't work out, right? The United States has stepped into the breach with boosting liquid natural gas exports to the Europeans. Various other adjustments have been made. Where are we now? It's kind of hard to say. The Russians have a problem with inflation, right? Everybody knows that. They have really rejiggered their economy. I mean, one thing that Putin did kind of politically to make the war palatable was that he confiscated the assets of Western corporations and handed them out to the thugs that surround him, right? And the Russian economy has been put on a war footing to a greater degree than Western economies, right? Is the Russian economy, could they run up against the wall here at some point? It's being debated. No, it doesn't look like they're about to fall off the cliff. They're certainly facing a number of challenges, right? The American sanctions hasn't made life easier for them. I think we can safely say.
Given that the US would pull out of NATO, have we seen any prepositioning in other countries of stockpiles, as you said, not just Russia and not just China, and other the African nations, physically or energy wise or I don't know, organizationally? Are there any new alliances, do we know anything about the wargaming?
That's a really good question. I can't tell you what third parties are doing. I mean, everybody, of course, is rethinking their situation. You know, by the way, with respect to military stocks, European countries now are beginning to worry that if they give too much to Ukraine, that they won't have enough on hand to defend themselves, right? In the event that this war expands in the next couple of years. So countries do have those kind of worries. My guess is that in every capital around the world, people are scratching their heads and trying to figure out what's going to happen in the United States and what kinds of changes are going to be incumbent, right? If Trump comes back into power in November.
You touched briefly on, the fact that, the Russians, I believe you said that were confiscated Western, assets in Russia
So
or frozen.
they've been frozen, yeah, and, there's been a debate on what to do with them, right? And up till now, they're still frozen. Only a tiny fraction of those assets are actually in the United States, right? A lot of them are in Europe. Some people have argued that, we ought to put those assets to work helping the Ukrainians, right? And financing the Ukrainian war effort. I'm inclined to, I can't say that I have full expertise on this question, right? And that I've examined every angle of it. But I'm inclined to look with favor upon that argument myself.
How much faith do you think other countries have in the US? If one president can sign an agreement, then the next one comes in and tears it up.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, confidence in the United States is lower than it was, right? For a long time, we had something approximating a bipartisan foreign policy. I mean, there were always changes, right, with administrations, changes in emphasis. But NATO was, sort of bedrock American policy, right? And obviously the lurches right now are much more extreme than they've ever been before. And a second Trump presidency would be a dramatic change, right? And obviously this doesn't inspire confidence, and people have started to hedge. The changes would be so massive that it's hard to even think through. I'm sure that all around the world, people are trying to start thinking through this. But it's a completely new world, right, that we would be in.
The argument that the right uses is that we have problems on our streets, homelessness, decaying infrastructure, and can't spend money on all the rest of the world all the time. So what is the solution to, or the balance, I guess, between protecting, preventing further Russian aggression, because it's even worse than you said, possibilities like Kaliningrad, that type of place, and balancing our needs here domestically where we can help veterans, homeless, and take care of our own population.
So the question is it going to be easier to tackle domestic American problems by blowing up the international security regime? I submit it's not going to make it any easier.
But now
We tried that in the 1920s and it didn't work very well.
now we have another problem. We're getting involved with Iran again. And with Israel, Gaza. And that's added in to while we're trying to help the Ukraine. I feel like we're being weakened by being pulled into all these different things. Are we the only one that are going to stand up and help Israel and Gaza and get that straightened out?
So it's quite clear, right, that the security situation is deteriorating everywhere. When the United States' adversaries see weakness, they respond.
I think the situation in Israel and Gaza and the West Bank is millennia old. It's religious people killing other religious people. And the situation in Ukraine is very different. It's just one country aggressively trying to take over another democratically elected country. And for that reason, I think we should be spending much more of our effort defending the Ukraine than worrying about religious people killing other religious people, which is pretty much the history of mankind.
And Max Booth, the national security or the security analyst, somebody I never thought that I would be agreeing with day after day, right? Because he was always very hawkish and very much on the right wing of the Republican Party, right, 10 or 20 years ago. But he's been making the argument, which I think is totally solid and convincing recently, that supporting Ukraine is a great bargain, right? The Ukrainians have been demolishing Russia's military forces. They're doing it without a single American casualty. And we're spending something like 4% of our military budget on Ukrainian aid, right? That this is the cheapest destruction of Soviet military capacity that we've ever seen, right, in history, and that it's an awfully good bargain. So for those of you who are worried about the cost of all of this, you can study Booth's arguments, which strike me as on target. That doesn't mean we don't have a lot of problems around the world.
Well, it's going to work, right? Oh, yay. I was sitting here and I was listening to a lot of the comments and things that were being said, and this is really not a question, it's just more of a statement. You know, we see what is going on in our country when we turn on Fox News, CBS News, all of the, the world, our news stations, right? So I think that it should be taken into account that we don't see everything that goes on in every country to know what every country is doing to assist those who are, in these wars, right? So I think that we need to kind of get off of our high horse and assuming that we're the only ones doing things, because that's clearly not the case, because this is a world. There are a lot of people in the world, we're all working together, so I don't think that we need to have this idea that, oh, America is the greatest and we are the only ones doing things, because that's not true.
That's a good comment, and it may be true that not every member of NATO has put itself forward in the Middle East right now. But the NATO countries have made a remarkable contribution to the defense of Ukraine. Let's not forget that, right? And now the Europeans have made available another 50 billion euros, but they have depleted their military stocks and rushed equipment to the Ukrainians proactively, sometimes ahead of the United States, right? And they have boosted their defense spending prodigiously because of the clear and present threat to their own security, right? In part, but we're not in this alone, indeed. No, you're totally right about that.
I've done some reading on the Middle East, and we are not so much fighting certain countries over there, we're fighting different religious groups. Hamas, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. That's my opinion, if we can keep them somewhat at bay over there, it might stop them from trying to come over here to the US to cause trouble. We hit 85 different sites. Iraq and Syria. These people move around from place to place. It's hard to keep track of them. But just think of how many different religious sects are over in these countries, and they're all fighting each other. Like I said, in my opinion, let's keep them fighting over, try to stop them over there before they really get heavy into our country.
If you guys had asked me to give a talk about the Middle East today, I would have said no. I don't really know enough to give an intelligent talk about the Middle East. I'm certainly worried about the stability of the region right now. Looking at what, if the Suez Canal is really shut down, right, on a semi-permanent basis, that's going to have an impact on Europe. That's going to increase transportation costs. 1/3 of the world's commerce goes through the Suez Canal, right? It could be closed. It could be closed indefinitely soon, it seems to me, right? Given what's going on. That's not a very happy scenario for anyone. But I don't want to venture further into Middle Eastern politics and say something foolish, which is probably what I would do.
40% of Egypt's, shipping is cut down right now, in the Suez Canal from this. But I just want to give you a little anecdote that, some American soldiers that are former veterans are fighting in the Ukraine. And their big surprise is that we have sort of walked the military stuff up to this point, like we're going to deliver F-16s. But when the American military people are fighting with them, they say, we can't call in nice airstrikes. What about this? We use this over here in Iraq. Why can't we do that? And they don't have it. So that shows you how much more difficult it is for the Ukrainians to fight the Russians because they don't have our technological advances and the full technology behind them. So we need to get maybe some F-16s over there or something to help them.
Well, the Ukrainians are training on F-16s now, no?